Hi, and welcome to this session on emotional resilience. In this session, I'm going to cover a lot of things that I have found to be missing in most stress management workshops or emotion management courses. The problem I see is that most resources on managing stress tend to give you a generic list of techniques to try. Practice mindfulness, exercise, eat well, sleep well, all that sort of stuff. Now, of course, all these activities will help. So it's the right thing to suggest them. And I also talk a lot about them. However, in most cases, I think there are three crucial steps missed that should come before doing any of those techniques. These missing steps are likely to be the answer as to why you've maybe been unable to manage your stress levels as effectively as you'd like and potentially more sustainably, despite knowing all these techniques. So, what are these three missing steps? So, the first missing step is to stop calling everything stress. It seems that no matter what emotion we feel, we tend to label it as stress. If we're worried, we say we're stressed. If we're annoyed at someone, we say that person is really stressing us out, and so on. But underneath that label of stress is an emotion. And so it's actually more helpful for us to begin to identify, understand, and explore the emotions we're feeling underneath that label of stress. Because that way we will have a better idea of what we need in order to manage that emotion. The second missing step is to develop a better understanding of yourself. So, in terms of your triggers, what triggers your emotions, how emotions show up in you, what you need in order to help you manage those emotions. These are likely to be very individual to you and different to what others experience or need. The third missing step is to get a better understanding about the biology of emotions and what happens in the brain and in the body when we feel emotions. If we have a better understanding of the biology, we have a better chance at choosing the right technique to help us manage an emotion or even reduce the likelihood of being triggered. As I said, in most stress management courses, you'll be given this generic set of techniques. However, this list is often given without any explanation as to what's happening inside of you or how to identify which technique will help and why. Therefore, each time you try something, it'll probably be a bit hit or miss as to whether it works. So, you take mindfulness, for instance. You might try it, but without knowing kind of why or whether it's really what you need, then it's quite likely that maybe on some days it might work, but on others it won't. But if you understand emotions, how they show up in you, what's going on in your biology, and therefore what you actually need, then you're more likely to find the right technique pretty much every time. And in this session, I'm going to explore how this all works. But before we do that, let's just have a look at the words and the terms emotional resilience. What do we actually mean by that? Now, whenever I've asked people what emotional resilience is or what they believe it to be, what it means to them, their answers can usually be categorized into like the following. So, an ability to deal with stress, to bounce back quicker from setbacks, and to stay calm and confident under pressure. And ultimately, when I ask people, well, why do you want to be even emotionally more resilient? What I hear people saying is that they want this because they actually just want to be the best that they can be and happy in all they do. So, effective emotion management, I think, is a bit of a three-pronged approach. So, you've got the psychological aspect. So, how do you take control over what you're thinking and how you're thinking, including noticing the labels you're using or the interpretations of what's going on or your assumptions and beliefs, either about other people, about yourself, and about the world around us. Then you've got the physical side of things. So, how do you help your body and brain function more effectively? And this is where it includes, the sleeping, the eating right, the moving, resting, connecting to nature, all the stuff we know, but we don't always do, and we don't always associate with emotional health. And then you've got the social aspect. So, how do you create and maintain meaningful relationships to increase feelings of safety and reduce feelings of threat? Now, in this session, I'm going to offer up some strategies under each of these three areas to help in two ways. Firstly, in the moment of an emotional hijack, when you've totally been triggered by something and you wish you hadn't, and you need to find a way to manage this emotional hijack, this trigger. And then secondly, to help you to create a foundation of habits that will help to reduce the likelihood of an emotional hijack. And these habits will help also to reduce the length of time an emotion stays around. It will reduce the intensity of that emotion. And so by putting in place preventative measures to reduce your vulnerability to experiencing an emotional hijack and increase your ability to diffuse the intensity of the emotion, it will ultimately help you to bounce back quicker. Okay, so let's have a look at what actually emotions are. I'm not sure we always spend time really defining what they are and exploring what they are. So, emotions, they are natural. They are natural and normal responses to the events that happen in our everyday lives. They drive our behavior in everything we do and every decision we make. And the overall purpose of emotions is to help us to survive. That is why they fundamentally drive our behavior. And it's surprising, really, that something that can be so fundamentally impactful on the quality of our day-to-day lives was completely left off the school syllabus. Now, emotions get triggered when we perceive there is a threat to our well-being or that we might die. Now, we get triggered when we think we might die, actually physically die, but also psychologically die. Things like my life won't be the same without this person. Or socially die, this idea that we might get rejected from the group, that, they'll laugh at me, or, they just won't want me to be around. So everyone experiences emotions, but the extent to which they show up and are expressed can vary from person to person. Some people feel emotions more deeply than others, and some people express them more outwardly than others. Every person is different. And so, whilst all the information I'm going to be sharing with you is universally true for us all, it's equally important to understand how you personally experience emotions. Emotions can get triggered rapidly and automatically by situations, people, and even thoughts, and can appear as if out of nowhere, making it feel like they're not in your control. And furthermore, not understanding emotions can also lead to us believing that there's not much we can do about them. This can leave you feeling stuck and at the mercy of any emotion that shows up in you. But you are more in control of your emotions than you might think. And an important point to note here is that emotions are meant to be short-lived. So if they're not expressed, they will cause problems in your body and in your mind. And yet we often push them aside, pretend they're not there, and hope they'll go away. But the key is, I'm afraid, to do quite the opposite. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But let me tell you a bit more about the different emotions that it's possible for us to feel. Now, I want to talk a little bit before that about the language we use. So, as human beings, we experience a range of emotions that psychologists have categorized into 9 emotion families. Well, the research to understand these families is still ongoing. And you can see on the slide here that, there's things like fear, sadness, anger, guilt, shame, jealousy, envy, disgust, and happiness. Those are the 9 families they've been categorized into. I believe the ones that are probably the most understood are fear and anger and possibly sadness. Now, all emotion families share 3 qualities. So they, number 1, have a reason for showing up in us. Number 2, they initiate an urge to act. And number 3, they prepare our bodies to take action to help us to survive or protect our well-being. Hormones will be released, blood sugar levels will change, and there will be a redirection of energy in our body. And one aspect of emotion management that I think is actually a bit unhelpful for us, as I was saying, is the language we use. So I think there's a couple of aspects here. So you talk about judgment. So we talk about negative and positive emotions, which means we'll be inclined to get rid of the ones that we class as negative and try to obtain the ones we describe as positive. But no emotion is good or bad. As I said, they all have a reason for showing up in us. And what's more true and a more accurate way to describe them is to think of them more maybe as the comfortable ones or uncomfortable ones, the pleasant emotions we like or the unpleasant ones, the ones we like to feel, the ones we don't like to feel. So it's important to be mindful of this judgment we have around emotions, calling some negative and some positive. I've already talked a little bit about this, but the word stress is really unhelpful. And as I said, it's helpful because we use it as a catch-all to describe any emotions. It does seem to be more acceptable to say, I'm stressed, rather than I'm pissed off, or I'm worried, or I'm sad, or I feel guilty, or ashamed, or jealous. And it's not surprising we use the word stress instead of naming emotions, because to be honest, most of us have had little, if any, education around emotions. We're actually quite illiterate when it comes to describing our emotions. And I guess the word stress has also become a universally unhelpful habit of language, I think. Like any word that enters our kind of common psyche. I'm pretty sure there was once a time when every adjective wasn't superseded by the word super. So, if we can more articulately name the feeling, the emotion we're feeling, rather than calling everything stress, then we'll be giving ourselves a much better chance of dealing with our emotions and therefore reduce the impact they can have on how we function in our day-to-day lives. And the third point here is about the word overwhelmed. So, similar to the word stress, it's wrongly thought of as an emotion, when in fact, I believe we use it to describe when we're in a state that is full of lots of emotions. So, we can often feel many emotions at once. You might be feeling worried about something coming up in your day, then you might feel annoyed at being worried because you shouldn't be worried, but you're getting angry at yourself for being worried. And then perhaps you feel ashamed because then you felt annoyed at yourself. There's a whole load of things. And in that moment, you might describe yourself as feeling overwhelmed. The word overwhelmed is also often used to describe the intensity at which an emotion is felt. So, you might feel an emotion at such a high intensity that it feels overwhelming to feel. And I'm going to come on to the idea of intensity of emotions next, actually. So, current research has found that each of the 9 emotion families contain a range of emotions that can be felt at different intensities. This accounts for the many variations of feelings we experience and therefore the many different words we actually do have within each emotion family. I'm going to look closely at 4 of the 9 emotion families, and that's fear, anger, sadness, and happiness. Now you'll see here on this slide, there's a spectrum of intensity around the fear family. And you can see the spectrum runs from low intensity on the left all the way through to high intensity on the right. You can see here on the fear spectrum that the variations of feelings in this family can range from mild concern through to worry, anxiety, and terror. So if you've ever felt worried or anxious, these feelings are part of the fear family. So when I talk about anything to do with fear, for instance, the flight or fight response, which I'm sure many of you have heard about and come across, I'm also talking about worry and anxiety. They would just be experienced at different levels of intensity to fear or terror. And as I said, all emotions share 3 core qualities. They have a purpose for showing up in us, they initiate an urge to act, and they prepare our bodies to take action to help us survive. So understanding the purpose of each emotion family, what action it stimulates us to want to take, and how that emotion shows up in our bodies and minds can be a great first step into helping you to manage and take control of that emotion. So you can see here that fear, which again, as I said, includes anxiety and worry, is triggered when you perceive that there is a threat to your life, your health, or your well-being. And fear actually helps us to escape from or avoid danger or the threats to your life. Now, in our early prehistoric days, as humans, we of course experienced far more actual life-threatening situations than we do today. However, fear is still experienced a lot in our modern day life because it can be activated in any situation that we think presents some sort of threat to us. When you feel fear, your heart rate increases, your body temperature will go up, your blood sugar levels will rise as energy is redirected to your muscles. The hormones cortisol, adrenaline, and noradrenaline will all rise, and things like your digestive system will be shut down because it's simply just not needed to help you avoid danger in that moment. Now, I suspect a lot of you will know a lot about fear and a lot of the things that I'm talking about here, particularly the flight and fight response. So some of this won't be new news to you. But later I'm going to tell you a bit more about how emotions are experienced in the brain, which hopefully will add to your knowledge here. So that's fear. Let's look at anger. Anger is triggered when something or someone important to you is taken away, or something or someone is getting in the way of you achieving your goal. In fact, I probably think we experience emotions on this spectrum of anger quite a lot throughout our days at work, because anger helps you to fight for what you feel is being taken away or for what you want. And again, this is related to the fight or flight response. So this is the fight part of the fight or flight response. And you can see the range of emotions here run from feeling a little bit irritated through to annoyed and all the way through to the intense feeling of feeling completely livid. And similarly, when you feel anger, similar to kind of fear, your heart rate increases, your body temperature will go up, blood sugar levels will rise, again, as energy is redirected to your muscles. The hormones cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline will all rise. Similarly, your digestive system will be shut down. And usually you have the urge to punch someone or shout and scream abuse at them. Sound familiar? Okay, so that's anger. Let's have a look at sadness. So sadness is triggered when you experience a loss. So this might be if a loved one dies or leaves you, but also if you lose something you value or hoped for. Like if you lost your job or didn't make it through the interview process for a job you really, really wanted. Now, sadness is really helpful because it helps you to withdraw so you can rethink how to do life after losing something or someone, and helps you to communicate to others that you may need help. And you can see from the range of emotions, they start from feeling a bit down all the way through to feeling depressed. Interestingly, sadness is often the result of the absence of many of the hormones that are associated with happiness and feeling good. Those hormones are things like oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin, things you probably come across as well. So there's also a specific hormone, though, that produces tears, which is called prolactin. And this is more present in women than in men, as it's also the hormone used to help women lactate. Now, there's not a lot of research that's been done on the biological process around or the biological reasons around why we cry. However, some theories include that it is a way to expel some of the harmful levels of hormones like cortisol or noradrenaline that have built up in our bodies when we've experienced emotions like fear and anger. So when you cry, your body also releases other hormones like endorphins and oxytocin, which are the ones that are quite nice to feel. And these hormones help relieve emotional distress along with physical pain. So it seems that kind of crying is really a self-soothing behavior. It helps you process and regulate intense emotions. And also when you cry, your body, I don't know if you notice this, is your body actually starts to relax. Your heart rate slows down. And I guess this makes sense in terms of why we cry when we're either really sad, as well as when we're experiencing intense feelings of happiness and when we're relieved. So I think crying is also, finally, a final point around crying, it's also thought to play a social role too, as it signals to people that, you're not okay, and it draws them in to want to support you. Okay, what about happiness? So, happiness is triggered when you get what you want, when circumstances have exceeded your expectations, or you've experienced things like feeling accepted or connected to someone, or even love. So, happiness helps you to continue to do the activities and to search for the activities that enhance these good feelings. And get both for yourself and for the people you kind of care about. So it helps you notice, helps you spot the things that make you feel good when your needs are met, and how do you continue to kind of go after those things. And the spectrum, as you can see, of feelings range from feeling just content all the way through to euphoric. And like I said, and I've mentioned already, there's different types of happiness are stimulated by different hormones, which include dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphins. And I will go into those in a bit more detail shortly. In fact, probably next. So, as I'm conscious that I've mentioned quite a lot of these hormones, I do want to kind of summarize them. So let's have a look at the next slide, which talks a bit about, the chemistry of emotions and what hormones you're going to be experiencing. So with fear and anger, as I said, it's generally cortisol, adrenaline, and noradrenaline. Let me just explain a bit more about those, because I think we often talk about these and we know about cortisol, we know about adrenaline, but we don't always really talk about actually what each of them do and why they're different. So adrenaline is released to provide like a massive surge of energy immediately to help you run away or fight. Cortisol is actually released more slowly, and it helps sustain that energy and remain focused and alert. So it's kind of like the adrenaline is like a fast acting emergency response. It kicks in instantly when danger appears or when we perceive danger to be there, preparing your body to run or fight and perform under pressure. It's short-lived and it's designed just to get you through the moment. So adrenaline, I suppose, is a bit like the fire alarm. Cortisol is probably a bit more like a backup generator. It keeps the system running under prolonged stress, helping your body manage over time. It's the longer term background manager that helps your body stay on alert and cope. It keeps your body in high alert mode, helping you stay focused over time. But actually, this can take a toll if there's no break. So, if emotions continue, cortisol rises, which mobilizes energy, suppresses digestion and immunity, your immune system, and can leave you drained if it hangs around for too long. So, yeah, to summarize, I guess, adrenaline is the fire alarm, cortisol is the fire warden who stays to manage the building. And, once you feel safe, levels of both these hormones will drop, unless, like I said, the emotion is ongoing, in which case cortisol can stay elevated, leading to burnout, extended periods of anxiety, or even more serious health issues. Now, I've also talked about noradrenaline. Now, this works mainly as a neurotransmitter rather than a hormone. So, neurotransmitters tend to be the ones that get released between neurons rather than traveling through the bloodstream like a hormone. So, noradrenaline sharpens focus and raises blood pressure to prepare for action, while adrenaline acts as a hormone that surges through the body in fight or flight, speeding the heart rate, opening the lungs, and releasing stored energy. So noradrenaline is much more about the raising the blood pressure, and a bit like cortisol, helping you to maintain that focus. Okay, so what about happiness? So there's tons of hormones actually related to happiness and the different sort of feelings we can feel. So you got dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins. Dopamine is often known as the feel-good hormone. It's part of the brain's reward system. We know about this. We hear about dopamine all the time. It gets associated with the good feeling we get when we feel rewarded. We talk a lot about it when we talk about social media hits, when people like your post, we get that hit of dopamine. Or if you achieve a goal, we get the hit of dopamine. Oxytocin is often referred to as the love hormone, but I actually think it's better described as the connection hormone. Oxytocin is essential for childbirth and strong parent-child bonding. It can also help promote trust, empathy, and bonding in other relationships too. And the levels generally increase with physical affection. So when you hug someone or stroke a pet, oxytocin is released. And then you've got serotonin. So serotonin helps regulate or stabilize your mood and well-being. Now, interestingly, it gets released when we feel we have secure access to food and resources we need. So that's why it's related to kind of feeling calm and content, because it's basically released when you have this calm, secure expectation that you'll get what you need and everything's okay. And therefore, it's often linked very much with helping you sleep, helping you digest things, and also helping you learn and retain. So anything to do with your memory. Okay, so that's kind of the happiness hormones. Let's come to sadness. I think I've mentioned a bit about this, but just to confirm some of this. So there are often low levels or an absence of all of those happiness hormones when we feel sadness. And as I said before, an increased levels of prolactin, which helps produce tears. So there you go. That's a bit of information about the 4 of the 9 emotion families. I mean, wouldn't it have been useful if we'd had this information at school? Maybe even pause for a moment now. I've given you a ton of information already, and have a think about which of these emotions maybe you experience more regularly than others. When did you last feel worried or frustrated or sad or happy? Did you experience any of the others that were mentioned earlier, like feeling guilty or shame? Or even, embarrassed, maybe feeling a bit jealous or envious. Have a think, when was the last time you felt any of those emotions, or which emotions you recognize you feel maybe more often than not? And maybe then also think about what might have triggered those emotions to happen. Hopefully you paused and had a think then, rather than just carried on straight through, but no worries if you didn't. I'm going to carry on and give you some more information about the ecosystem, what I've called the ecosystem of emotions. So hopefully this will build on what we've just gone through and help you think about and expand your ideas on what some of your triggers might be. As I talked about earlier, thinking about, what triggers some of those emotions that you've had. So coming back to the word stress, so I'm going to contradict myself now, because actually in this context, the word stress is actually very useful to use. But in the context of the things that put a stress on your body, the things that throw your body out of whack, the stuff that disrupts the equilibrium that is needed to be maintained in your body. Now, emotions can get triggered when we put stress on different parts of our ecosystem. So these stresses can throw your body, as I said, out of whack and disrupt that equilibrium. And this generates emotions that try to tell you what you need or make you more susceptible or vulnerable to being triggered. So you can see on my diagram here that there are several different types of triggers. So you've got the psychological triggers. These triggers are the ones that come from our minds that we may or may not be conscious of. So these include our thoughts, our assumptions, our beliefs, perceptions, judgments, and mindsets. These tend to be related to what we think or believe, as I said earlier, about ourselves, about other people, and or about the world in general. So, some of the thoughts or beliefs that you might have are like, I'm just not good enough to do that, or that person is a total control freak, or the world is a dangerous place. Those are some of the more negative based thoughts. You might have more positive ones where actually the world is a safe place, or I am good enough, or that person actually isn't a control freak. They're lovely and kind and nice. But these are the thoughts that we have, and they will trigger what emotion you feel in response to them. You also then have the external triggers. So these triggers tend to be from our environment, whether that includes things like the tangible stuff, like our physical surroundings, to less tangible things like culture and other people's behavior. Although I'd probably say it's often our thoughts about a person or an environment that can sometimes trigger us more than the actual person and environment itself. However, as you're probably aware, there is a ton of research that shows that being in nature can actually affect your biological processes, like lowering heart rate and blood pressure. So, our physical environments can, in themselves, either put a stress on our bodies as well as relax our bodies. So, for instance, not being around or near green spaces could be having an impact on causing stress to your body or your brain. Now, other stresses that I would put in the external category would be things like when any sort of change happens around us. Of course, some people also enjoy change, so this might not be true for all. But there might be also external stresses that include work issues, like a problem with a boss or uncertainty, or again, talking about that change, a restructure, which is constantly happening in most of our lives. But also equally things that are happening in your personal life. So maybe problems with your kids or your family, or there's financial pressures. So all of these external triggers have the potential for putting a stress on your body and your mind. So that's the external ones. And then you've got the physical triggers. It's a bleak picture I'm painting, isn't it? But these tend to be that if you're dealing with some sort of physical injury or pain in your body, or even if your body is just tired and trying to deal with an infection, these things will put a stress on your system and make you more susceptible to being triggered emotionally. I'm sure that must feel familiar, when you've got an injury and you've hurt yourself, actually you do just feel a bit more susceptible to feeling emotions getting triggered, because it's hard coping with the pain as well as going on with your day-to-day life. So that's the physical ones. You're going to hate me for this one, but there's ingested triggers. So, what we put in our bodies, our diets, the levels of alcohol, caffeine, nicotine, and any other sort of drugs, they can put a stress on your system. If we're putting the food into our body that's the right sort of food that gives us the nutrition, great. But if it's not, it's probably putting a stress. And like I said, any sort of drugs will be putting some form of a stress on your body. But I'm going to move swiftly on from this one. So finally, there are internal triggers that can put a stress on your body. So you are constantly trying to stay in equilibrium. Your body is trying to make sure it's got the right levels of sugar or glucose going to the right places at the right time. So if the blood sugar levels are out of balance, that can cause a stress to your system. Things like inflammation as well also puts a stress on your body, as this is literally the way your body tries to fight an infection. So when we go into the fight or flight mode and we feel fear or anxiety, inflammation is much more likely to happen, because actually when you look back at our prehistoric times, the evolutionary reason why we get this inflammation is if we did get attacked and wounded but not killed by a saber-toothed tiger or a lion, your body would know that it needed to repair itself. So any feelings of fear would stimulate inflammation in the body in anticipation of needing to repair and heal wounds, even if you didn't actually have any wounds that needed healing. And then, I mean, of course, there's also, moving on from inflammation to other things that internally cause stress to your body. There's, the awful things like the diseases like cancer that can cause a stress as it tries to heal itself, not to mention the impact of chemotherapy. And all the other diseases that put a stress on our body. And our hormone levels, so I mean, this is really important. If they're not at the right level, can put stress on your body, particularly for women around their monthly cycle, as well as during the perimenopause and menopause. So as I said, I'm really sorry. I know this sounds like a bit of a bleak picture, but I wanted to show you and maybe give you some reassurance, yes, really reassurance, around why emotion management is not always easy and not always straightforward, and why, just a mind-based technique might not help you manage your emotions, because there is so much stuff going on that impacts and intersects and is interrelated as to why, when, and how we're feeling emotions. Now, these stresses will impact whether emotions get triggered and how long they stay with you. Also, if your body has been put under any sort of stress by any, there's a likelihood that you'll be more susceptible, as I said, to being triggered, because you'll have this heightened state of threat mode. We all know those times, as I said, when we're in pain and perhaps haven't had a lot of sleep, or have been worried, particularly about something at home. So our tolerance levels are lower, and we're more likely to become enraged, by that email from that particular person. However, maybe when you read that email again the next day, when you're not feeling as much as you were the day before, you realize actually it wasn't as bad as you thought it was. So, like I say, it's not simple, it's not straightforward. They're all interrelated. And I want to go on to now explain a little bit more about some examples around how things are related to each other, and actually why this isn't just a bleak picture. It actually provides an opportunity for hope, and also hope how you can kind of take control of your emotions slightly more. So, because our thoughts, our feelings, our biology, and our behaviors are all connected, it means that if you change one of them, it can have a knock on effect to changing the others, both in a helpful way and an unhelpful way. As you can see, kind of from this diagram in the slide, the arrows show the bidirectional nature of how thoughts, feelings, biology, and behavior are all connected, where each one can affect the other. So, bring this to life with a bit of an example. Let's just take delivering a presentation. You've got to do a presentation, and maybe this is something you just don't enjoy doing, don't like doing. So the thoughts you might start to have, these might sound a bit familiar for you, that race through your mind might be, I can't do this, people will laugh at me, just not good enough, I'm not prepared enough. What if I forget what I'm going to say? What if they ask me questions I don't know answers to? So all of that sort of stuff. In fact, it's quite likely that some, if not all of those thoughts may well have been swirling around in your mind long before the day you were due to give the presentation. It's also quite likely that those thoughts are going to be leading you to feel worried and nervous. And then maybe because you notice you're starting to feel nervous, this might then have a knock-on effect, and you might actually start feeling a bit annoyed with yourself that you're feeling nervous. I know this is true for me. I get terribly nervous before the start of any of my workshops or talks or presentations. And then I get really hard on myself in those situations, saying, why am I getting so nervous? I do this all the time. I know I'll be fine. It's like I feel I really let myself down. Why can't I just do better, differently, be less nervous? I don't want to feel like this. I definitely feel myself getting nervous when get annoyed when I get nervous. But then those anxious feelings, and maybe even now you're adding a bit of annoyance into that, might take you back to the original thoughts of, yeah, see, I can't do this. I can't even control my nerves, So you've got this perpetual interaction between your thoughts, the feelings, and then back to the thoughts. And when all of this is going on and you're feeling nervous, not only will you start to tense up, so we start looking at the biology, you might start to tense up, You'll find you're probably also not able to think clearly. Maybe your hands might start to go sweaty or clammy. Your heart rate probably will be increasing. Your face might even turn red. I mean, really annoying. And perhaps you'll even start shaking, which then, can trigger, another thought of, oh my God, I'm shaking now. And, I need to hold my notes, but my hands are wobbling around and people are going to know I'm nervous now. So I can't hold my notes because they'll see everything shaking. And but then if I can't hold my notes, I won't remember what I want to say, etc., etc. So again, you've got this interaction between a bodily reaction and then a thought about it. You may also notice that your breathing becomes a bit more restrictive, or it quickens, or even you might start to feel a bit dizzy. And these are all the kind of tangible biological things that it's possible, I suppose, for us to see or feel is happening. However, alongside the what you can see and feel parts of the biological reaction are also the bits that you can't see that are happening inside you that no one else notices, and you don't may also not notice. So, your hormone cortisol will have increased. Your digestion might have paused or maybe get overactivated. I know sometimes I have a desperate need to go to the toilet when I get nervous, and that's all part of the biological response. I also get a bit of acid reflux, when I get nervous. So I do these little burps continuously. It's really annoying. But again, that's part of your digestive system is shutting down. And it's not helpful when you need to speak in front of a lot of people. And like I said, it's all related to your digestive system. And I guess other things, you might notice that you lose your appetite when you get nervous as well. Again, that's about your digestive system kind of shutting down. I mean, also your immune system, that tends to yo-yo because it's trying to figure out, what you need, what it needs to do to help you. So those are some of the things that might be going on in your biology. Not all of them, but some of them. I mean, it's enough really, isn't it? But that's some of them. And then you have your behavior. And so all of these things that are going on may affect your behavior. So it might mean that you decide to maybe even avoid the activity. So I'm not even going to do presentations because I don't want to go through all of this, and decide not to do it. Or you might mean that potentially you might over prepare and spend hours and hours making sure everything's just right in the presentation because you're so worried and want to make sure that no one asks you a question that you don't know the answer to. But then because you put so many hours in, maybe killed yourself doing it, you might not actually be feeling at your best when you come to do the presentation because you spent all this time preparing at the expense of maybe doing some of the things that either you enjoy or you need to keep you calm and rested, like going for a walk or eating properly or getting enough sleep. So I often think actually if we spent more time preparing ourselves, helping to get ourselves in a more helpful, relaxed state rather than spending so much time preparing the content in a presentation, we actually might not get so nervous. But anyway, so all of the things going on in your mind and in your body might also be affecting kind of the way you hold your body. And I've put this in the kind of behavior section. When you go and do the presentation. So maybe you might not walk up very confidently to the front of the room, or you might hold your body in a more hunched over position, a kind of protective, kind of cowering position. Your head and shoulders might be bent forward, perhaps not even making eye contact with anybody. So you can see how all of these interrelate. And as I said, it's not all in one direction. So the increase in cortisol might make you start feeling even more worried, which might increase your heart rate, which might then make you have more thoughts about whether you can do the presentation or not, etc., etc. So they all interrelate. They all talk to each other, they all react to each other. It's a very intricate and kind of connected experience. And that's why I think sometimes it can spiral out of control and lead to things like panic attacks because we just don't know quite what's going on and it's just spiraling. But as I said, there is hope here, I promise you. Because if you change just one aspect of these, because there's so many interrelated aspects, it means you can pick one of them and it will have an impact on the others very positively and very helpfully. So, you change one and it is likely to have a knock-on impact to change the others. So using the same thing, let me go through an example of how things could be done differently once you've noticed certain things and how you can intercept what's going on. So I suppose, to be honest, also, it does all start with noticing in the days or weeks leading up to the presentation around if you're feeling nervous about it. If you're hearing yourself saying any of those thoughts, like, what if I don't remember everything? Or what if they ask me things I don't know? Listen out for that because it won't just be on the moment of giving the presentation. It would have been in the build up. And I think part of emotional resilience is about being aware of how you're feeling and when you're feeling it, and as soon as you're feeling it, because often we try to ignore it and push it away. So if you can notice that you're finding maybe in your behavior you're over preparing, or that you are feeling nervous in any way due to the thoughts you're having, or even if you just notice your heart is starting to race at just the thought of the presentation, then, beforehand, I would say, look at what things you can do to relax and get yourself in a helpful state. That might be, about making sure you don't spend every minute leading up to the presentation writing it, and instead spend some time doing things that make you feel good. I do often try and prioritize sleep. It's not always easy, but I also find watching kind of comedy, it actually calms me down quite a bit. I think laughter is quite good at that. So that's all the stuff you can do beforehand. However, if you get to the day of the presentation and notice any of these signs in your thoughts, your biology, your behavior, these are some things you can do to, like I say, intercept it. So you notice your thoughts, perhaps then in that moment, you might actually be able to change the thoughts you're having. It's hard, right? And I don't always think this is possible. But, is there a way you can actually start saying, actually, maybe this is just adrenaline helping me to prepare. It's just my body preparing me to perform. It's perfectly normal and natural. Everyone feels like this before a presentation, or most people do. And I often say to myself, look, as soon as you start talking, you're going to be okay. So, is there a way you can just notice the thoughts you're having and try and find some more positively framed ones? But I don't always think that's the most easiest one to do, to be honest. So there are some things those thoughts might reduce the worry, but I would almost say have a look at the biology aspect of it. Now, there's a wonderful technique called the physiological sigh, which I will go into in the workshop. And some of you will already be aware of some breathing techniques. Some are better than others. Some might work better for you than others. But there are several techniques that can help, several breathing techniques, particularly this physiological sigh, that will calm your heart rate down and might help you then to go back to those thoughts, to reframe them, because you can think more clearly. You're calming your system down, which enables you to think more clearly. So I would absolutely advocate for the physiological sigh, which, as I said, I will talk you through in the workshop. But also, then there's what you can do with your behavior in your body. So there's a lovely TED talk by a lady called Amy Cuddy, and I'll make sure you have the link to be able to watch that. But she talks about how to hold your body in postures that communicate to yourself and to others, if necessary, that you feel confident. It's almost like a fake it till you make it via your body. So perhaps you could go, nip to the toilet, maybe for a couple of reasons in my case, and do one of the poses she mentions for a few minutes. And as I said, this will communicate to your body that you feel strong, that you feel powerful, that you feel confident, which will start to lower your heart rate. It'll increase things like testosterone, which is a hormone linked to feeling confident, and help you have more confident and grounded thoughts. As I said, I'll make sure you get a link to the TED Talk. But you can see there's a couple of things here. We're quite familiar with, try and reframe your thoughts. But there's a couple of things here in terms of your biology and your behavior that you can start to change to communicate and interact differently with some of the other aspects of this kind of whole process. And like I said, each of these techniques will help to change your state and in turn allow you to think more clearly. And if you can do several of them, at the same time, it will really help to reduce the nerves and help you as you begin your presentation. And you can start anywhere in this cycle. The key is to be aware of how you're feeling, know you can have some element of control over it, and try some of these techniques. And we'll explore more of this in the workshop, but I just wanted for now to just highlight how everything's connected, why yes, absolutely, it can go into a negative spiral, but it also means that you can intercept this spiral, break the connection, and create a more positive spiral too. Only a couple more things to show you. So I'd like to talk, I don't know if it's that common knowledge, and whereas some of the other things I may have been saying to you today in this session that you've probably come across, but the great cortisol steal, I think, is a really interesting piece of science that can, again, be really helpful to understand when we're trying to manage our emotions. So when we feel emotions like fear or anger, or the emotions we classically call as stress, as I've said before, cortisol is incredibly present in those emotions. So when you get any form of a stressor, like I talked about in the ecosystem of stressors, whether it's internal or external, whether it's a physical one or whether it's ingested, like some of the things up there, the psychological one could be a to-do list, the physical one could be an injury, external could be a toxic culture, internal could be any sort of sudden change in blood pressure or blood sugar levels. So when you get any sort of stressor, your cortisol levels will increase. Now, there's something called LDL cholesterol, and this makes all our hormones. But when we're under stress, when we're feeling any of those things, it makes much more cortisol. Okay, great, we needed it. But this is at the expense of the other essential hormones that we need. And the list of those hormones is long. So there are also the ones usually associated, as I said before, with positive emotions. So like serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine. I mean, you can see this list here, endorphins, and other hormones like testosterone, estrogen, insulin, which manages your blood sugar levels, leptin and ghrelin, which manage your appetite, melatonin that helps you sleep. So literally, LDL cholesterol will not be producing any of those hormones so that it can focus on producing cortisol that's needed. So you can see that we're on a bit of a losing battle there, because these are all the hormones that we need that are going to help us to come out of this feeling of stress and anger and fear, because they help us to get sleep we need, the food we need, they help us manage how much, what, and when we eat. These are hormones that help us feel calm, relaxed, happy, but they're not being made because cortisol is stealing the energy needed to make them. So when that's happening and all these other hormones have decreased, this makes us even more susceptible to threats and stress being triggered, and emotions like feeling fear and anger. So we're much more susceptible to that because all those hormones aren't being produced. So this means then even more cortisol is produced and less of the other hormones are produced, which again continues to make us more susceptible to all the different stresses. And it just goes on and on and on. Now, I include this here, I'm going to say, for a bit of reassurance, and yes, I really do mean reassurance, to show the reason why we can sometimes find it hard to get ourselves out of the spirals we get into, and why we can find it hard to de-stress and calm down and come out of that kind of threat mode. But it also shows even more why it's important to do some of the things I'm going to take you through in the workshop to help reduce the likelihood of being triggered or enable you to bounce back quicker. We kind of need to hack our biology a little bit, and hopefully this great cortisol still process kind of shows you a bit about that. All right, we're on the home straight. Final bit of science around the brain that actually I want to talk to you about. And again, some of this may be familiar to you, but there's an element of it that was a real pivotal moment for me that really made sense around emotions and what we need to do and why we need to do it. So there's two key parts of our brain that are relevant to how emotions affect us. You've got the limbic system, and this is the part of the brain that processes our emotions. It often operates below our conscious awareness and is hyper sensitive and hyper vigilant, looking out for events, experiences, and people who might threaten our survival and well-being. It's kind of the oldest part of our brain from an evolutionary perspective. So that's the limbic system. Basically looks after all our emotions, processes emotions. Then you've got the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is the part of the brain where we do our more logical and rational thinking. So the prefrontal cortex is involved in slower and more conscious processes, and from an evolutionary perspective, is the newest part of our brain. So I guess in simple terms, and I have simplified this massively, but you could think of the limbic system as our emotional part of the brain and the prefrontal cortex as the logical part of our brain. Now, our brain's main purpose is to help us to survive. So, because our brain's main purpose is to help us survive, our limbic system is constantly on the lookout to tell us what to pay attention to, and will create an emotional reaction if it feels that we are in danger or are likely to be in danger. But it can't always tell whether a threat is real or perceived. So we'll react in the same way to something that is very real, like the need to run away from an angry or even hungry tiger, or perceived in the form of an unending to-do list. So whenever you get any of those stresses or triggers that I've just described, the limbic system will kick into action and there will be an automatic response. And part of that response will be generating an appropriate emotion to meet the perceived needs of the situation. This emotion will then prepare our body to take the most appropriate action to help us to survive. This is a quick and automatic response in our limbic system and is designed to protect us. Ultimately, as I said, our brain wants to minimize danger and maximize safety. Now, all of this is going on, not new news, talked about this for a lot. But when the limbic system is activated, it will actually fundamentally prevent your prefrontal cortex from functioning. So that's because the brain is trying to help you to survive and therefore recognizes the need for a rapid response. The limbic system can produce the required speedy response, whereas the prefrontal cortex will slow things down. You can see this in the diagram. I've called it a triagram because it's kind of triangles and a diagram. My new word. So in my triagram, you can see how this is represented, that as the limbic system triangle gets bigger, the prefrontal cortex triangle gets smaller. And the point here is that over-arousal of the limbic system fundamentally reduces the ability of the prefrontal cortex to function. You know those times, right, when you can't think straight or you can't focus or your thoughts feel like a big fat mess of spaghetti and you just can't grab hold of any of it? Well, that's a sign that the limbic system has hijacked your prefrontal cortex, stopping it from working and disabling your ability to think clearly or rationally. And you may have noticed earlier on, I've been using the term emotional hijack, and this is where this term comes from, because this experience is often called an emotional hijack. And it's why, when I said if you're trying to reframe your thoughts in the middle of an emotional hijack, why it can be quite difficult because you just can't connect your rational brain in because you're feeling the emotion so strongly and the limbic system has overpowered your prefrontal cortex. And it's kind of why it's so important to recognize and deal with the emotions that show up in you so you can get the prefrontal cortex working effectively again. Because if you can manage the emotions and the physiological symptoms, it gives the prefrontal cortex a much better chance of kicking back into action and back into action sooner. Another point to mention here, as you might have seen on the slide, is that every time you have an emotional reaction, for instance, anything in the fear family, worry, anxiety, the body shuts the systems down that it doesn't need. And I've talked about this already. So if the urge to act is to run away and fight, then all the energy will be going to your muscles that will help the body to do that. And in turn, it will shut down the systems the body doesn't need, like the immune system and like the digestive system, as I've kind of mentioned before. But I believe, this is why, stress, which we often call it, any emotional reaction, has been linked to problems with the digestive system because it keeps getting shut down. And if you're in a permanent state of worry, fear, anxiety, never allowing the emotion to be expressed, then all havoc will be being caused in your digestive system. Emotions are actually meant to be short-lived. They're meant to help you in that moment, to help you survive. And we are also meant to enable you to fulfill the urge to act that they're creating in you. So actually, if we're not able to do that, if you can't express the emotion or expel the energy by fulfilling that urge, whether that's running away, throwing a few punches, this will be having an impact on your body as the effects of that unspent emotion will build up in you. And I want to say a word about suppression. As you'll see on this slide, suppression won't stop emotions affecting your body. So you might be able to cover it up. People might not be able to see, an emotion is being felt in you, but it doesn't stop everything happening, all the physiological responses happening in your body. So, like I said, the digestive system will still be shutting down, even if you're suppressing an emotion and try not to show it. The immune system will go all over the place. It will shut down in the immediate danger and then ramps up after the danger, i.e. this bit about inflammation. Cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline will all be racing around your body, which means, again, those other hormones aren't being produced. So suppression is not the answer here. It might mean that you can get through the day not showing an emotion to people or expressing it, but actually all this stuff will be going on. And so if you're not addressing it and not facing into the emotion and finding a way to expel that energy, then all this stuff is going to be having problems in your body. But there is some good news here, honestly. The good news is that I do believe that you can deal with any situation you're faced with and cope with any emotion and deal with any emotion. The key is to understand what's going on in you and understand what you need and be able to find ways to express that emotion, which will help you get your prefrontal cortex back in the game as quickly as you can. And like I said, you do this by dealing with the emotion you're experiencing, which will reduce the activity in the limbic system and increase the activity in the prefrontal cortex. So that, you'll probably be pleased to know, is everything I wanted to share with you in this video. And my parting thought really is this, emotional resilience is not about always feeling strong and positive. It's about understanding and managing your emotions in a healthy and sustainable way. And we'll go through a lot of that in the workshop. I've talked some of it right now. But in preparation for the workshop, there is some things I'd like you to do to have a think about and come prepared to share and chat about. So what I'd love you to do in the next few weeks is to make a note of what things trigger you to get stressed, or as we're now calling it, have an emotional reaction. And when you get those reactions, make a note either at the time, although it might be quite difficult, but as soon as possible afterwards, make a note of the following things. What did you notice about your thoughts? What specific thoughts did you have? Were they things like, oh, they'll think I'm an idiot, or who am I to speak up, or what if it all goes wrong? What are the specific thoughts that you noticed you were thinking? And be honest with yourself, write them down. What actually happened to your thinking? So did you notice the quality of thinking was much more racing thoughts? There was a rapidity of the thoughts in your mind? Or did you find you were ruminating and there was repetitive thinking going on and you just couldn't stop that cycle? Maybe you found you couldn't make a decision, or like I said before, if everything felt like spaghetti, or you just couldn't think straight or focus. So that's about your thoughts. Then, but also, what did you notice happening in your body? So did you notice any temperature rising or any tightness in any part of your body? Did you notice any area tense up? Was it your shoulders or your stomach or your back or your arms? Or, did you notice your fists clenching? Or maybe even your stomach felt queasy? Make a note of what's happening in your body. And then also finally make a note of, what did you notice about the urges you had or your behavior? So did you notice a kind of, oh my God, I really need to cry here, or I've got this urge that I've just got to get out of here and get away? Or maybe, as I've mentioned, you've just had this urge to punch the person in front of you. So what sort of urges, or what did you notice about your behavior? Did you notice you slept more or less? Did you notice your hunger decreased or increased? Think about those. And actually, what's also you should have received with this video is a checklist of signs of emotional hijack, and so you can use that. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's a good place to start to help you think about if you can spot any of these signs when you've had some sort of emotional reaction. So thank you for listening and watching this video. I really look forward to chatting some more with you all when we come together for the workshop. For now, I'll see you soon.